Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society.
Hi, welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, and today we have Elizabeth Weiss as our guest. And Elizabeth is a professor of anthropology at San Jose State University. Her books include Reading the Bones, Activity, Biology, and Culture. That was in 2017. And more recently, in 2020, Repatriation and Erasing the Past with attorney James Springer, the focus of which is repatriation laws and the ideology behind them. In September 2024, she will begin a one-year faculty fellowship at the Center for Academic Pluralism through Heterodox Academy. And that is one of the things that we want to talk about today, is your affiliation with Heterodox and, in fact, a presentation that you're going to do in a few weeks. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm not sure, maybe I caught this wrong, but I am already at Heterodox Academy.
Okay.
So I started in September 2023 and will go till 2024.
Okay. That explains why you're in New York. I wondered why you were in New York and not California.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your appointment at Heterodox and that you're going to give a presentation that's relevant to something else that we want to talk about.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of anthropology at San Jose State, as you mentioned, and I decided to apply for the faculty fellow at Heterodox Academy while I was at San Jose State because of various issues surrounding the repatriation and reburial of skeletal remains, and hoping to jumpstart my ability to conduct research again. And so one of the things that I decided to do for Heterodox Academy is to look at museums, exhibits, and whether they display a variety of perspectives on their walls, right? And how they display the remains and the artifacts. And if they are too homogeneous in their viewpoint, to suggest to them ways to increase viewpoint diversity in museum exhibits. So that is my big project here. But the other aspect of being here at in New York City and with Heterodox is just to broaden my reach, to let people know my concerns, which are concerns for many anthropologists, I believe, even so sometimes they won't admit to it, about how the field is changing. The field is changing in ways that will basically gut the universities of collections, both teaching and research collections, empty museum walls, and also gut our ability to ask questions in terms of sex differences, and how those biological sex differences may play out in the present, but also were understood and played out in the past. So those are some of the main themes. What my first presentation at Heterodox Academy occurred a couple weeks ago now, I believe, at their opening, and it talked about the importance of skeletal remains and the importance of studying these skeletal remains to have viewpoint diversity in how we think these remains should be preserved or reburied. My next event at Heterodox will be a webinar that is a uncanceling event of a panel that was meant to be given at the American Anthropological Association, which is the largest anthropology conference in America, that was combined with the Canadian Anthropological Society. So it was a joint conference to be given in November. And the panel, which was put together by Kathleen Lowry, who's an anthropologist in the University of Alberta, was to make the claim that biological sex is still an important analytical variable for anthropologists, both physical anthropologists and cultural anthropologists, and that we should not abandon this concept of binary biological sex. That's not to say that we should ignore gender or that gender is binary, but that rather that these are two distinct things, sex and gender, and although they sometimes overlap, they don't always, and that the biological binary is an important concept to understand and to look at when looking at humans, whether it's in the past or the present.
Yeah, so I was reading the some of the materials that you sent me about the back and forth between the Anthropological Association and yourself, and some of your responses captured the same thing. One of the things that I read was, they said we should be, some academics have even started to explicitly label ancient human skeletons as non-binary or gender neutral, and I don't really. I mean, I'm a little confused about this. So I'm not a biologist or an anthropologist. I'm a psychologist, an experimental psychologist.
Sure.
So can you explain to me how a bone, I guess, or a skeleton or something like that could be labeled non-binary?
Yes. So, and in my talk on which was canceled and is now going to be on, I believe, November 8th, I will be talking about this issue about how do we determine whether remains were non-binary with bones, and I would say we cannot do that there is no way to look at a skeleton and say this person identified as a female but was actually biological male. When we look at skeletal remains, whether they are Neanderthal remains from tens of thousands of years ago to the Paleo-Indians 7,000 years ago to forensic cases of modern people, what we can determine by looking at the skeletal remains is sex, biological binary sex, male or female. But some anthropologists have now moved away from that and claim that when you cannot determine the sex, that's likely because the individual was non-binary. But of course, that's not the case. If you can't determine the sex, it just means that the remains were fragmentary, or maybe the remains belong to a young individual, prepubescent, and therefore maybe you need ancient DNA and not just looking at bones. Or maybe you're just not very good at assessing sex, right? It takes a little practice.
So just to be clear, if I choose to live as a man for the next however many years that I'm alive, it is not going to change my bones.
It's not going to change your bones. Now, medical transitioning may have some negative effects on bones, but it won't erase the ability of an anthropologist to determine whether you're a male or a female. And I think that that's an important aspect. And one of the things is that for me, it's a very backward way of thinking when anthropologists, bioarchaeologists look at a skeleton and say, oh, this individual was likely non-binary or was likely a female who was presenting as male because artifacts were aligned with the other sex. Because basically what they're sometimes doing is they're saying, well, you find a skeleton, it's a female skeleton osteologically from the bones, but the artifacts aren't what we would expect a female to have. Well, my conclusion would be maybe females weren't that restricted in their labor as we had thought, and that actually it's likely that females and males were doing many things, and therefore we were incorrect in assuming that sexual division of labor was so narrowly defined in any one culture. That would be my way of looking at it, because biological sex is a universal. It doesn't change from culture to culture, but sex differences in activity patterns, what women do, obviously does change. And so, same with what men do. And then there's much overlap. I mean, one of the things you can think about is like, you know, let's say you find a skeleton and it has a pouch of things that would be considered medicinal. Well, this could be a male shaman or a doctor, but it could also be the equivalent of a you know female who is looking was helping women have their children, right?
Or
So
carrying medication from a doctor
there too,
to
yeah,
someone
there's so
else.
many other possibilities besides erasing sex. um, you know, um, it could be that culture had doulas that had medicinal pouches, right?
Right.
Things like that. So I do think that it's kind of, ironically, it's kind of a backward idea, way of thinking, that the solution is that, oh, if you find artifacts that don't match with the sex, then it's likely that that person wasn't that sex. No, it's likely that people did a lot more varied things than we had previously thought.
And that is a bias worth talking about, right? How
Absolutely.
historically, in the modern historical times, maybe we had considered people's roles or their activities much too narrowly. And that is an example of a bias that's worthy of discussing. And I mean, you gave the example, and one of the things you'd written about was, right, I had forgotten about this, but they found a female Viking, right?
Yeah.
And it was this big celebratory thing, like, oh my gosh, it was a woman who, was what, and yet, I mean, has there been since then this effort to relabel the female Viking as non-binary?
Yes, there has actually been that effort. And it's this kind of effort just detracts from, the other option, which is that people do a lot of things and that cultures change, sex roles change. We see this in our own lifetime.
Right.
I don't see why we wouldn't assume that of the past. I also think that there's sometimes anthropologists sometimes, and I admit I'm guilty of this myself. Sometimes we view past people in stereotypical views, and we have to remember that people in the past were individuals the same as now. There were likely people who, were the dissidents or the heretics in the past too. So I think that that's an important aspect to remember.
And to suggest that a woman who fought, maybe Helen of Troy, a woman who was willing to fight or to sacrifice or to lead, an army, something like that, must think of herself as a man in order to do that is also very sexist.
It is
extremely sexist.
It's very sexist. And if you think about some of the great women leaders that we have seen, in historic times, I don't think Margaret Thatcher or Golda Meir was thinking that they had to be a man to be, a great political leader. And I think to think that in the past that these people had to think that way is quite frankly a sexist way of viewing archaeology.
So I have the anthropological ethics up here. I'm just looking at it, so be open and honest regarding your work. It feels a little sort of what we're talking about right now. But another one is, protect and preserve your records. And this feels a little bit like records may be in jeopardy, or maybe not. I'm wondering, like, what's the next generation, like your graduate students, right? What are they going to be looking at? And are they going to have to revisit a whole body of work because we have, sort of like, are they going to be making fun of us a little bit?
Hopefully not too much. But I think it's quite interesting that one of the aspects of anthropological ethics, both in the AAA and also the Society for American Archaeology and so forth, is preservation of the record, preservation of your data, preservation of the work. And yet so much of the modern ideology that they have tacked on are acts to destroy this. So if you think about reburials, how you're talking about the literal destruction of collections. That's not preservation. There's a movement to destroy other data forms like X-rays, photographs. This is not preservation. And whenever I've brought this up, I have been kind of villainized, and I've been said, well, you're not treating human remains ethically by talking about preservation of X-rays. But it's almost like they're schizophrenic, right? So they have these two very different types of ethics that don't mesh. And that's true when you're looking at it ideologically. So the importance of understanding evolution and biology, and yet the erasure of biological concepts like binary sex, and also when you're talking about literally the materials in hand. So preserving the skeletal collections on one hand, and then the other hand, working to have those collections, whether they're affiliated or not with a tribe, destroyed. So I think this is a very, unitable type of actions. These are opposed to each other, and yet they're all in the same list of ethics, which I think is quite an interesting thing. I think that what we'll see in anthropology in future generations is that there'll be less research that is done on skeletal remains, on topics that are controversial, and anthropology will morph into a kind of sociology type of field, political sociology, with very little of the origin of anthropology, wanting to understand different cultures and different people from evolutionary and biological and cultural perspective.
I am seeing the same thing in psychology, and sort of this same kind of dualism. This sort of schizophrenic, view of. I think I mentioned to you I was canceled for a research project also, and the same idea. It's like, well, no, language use is the hot topic in right at the time 3 years ago. This is really a hot topic, and research would be the safest way to study something that would be offensive. And yet, we're told that we can't study something that might be offensive within an experimental paradigm. And so I see that in what you're talking about with, it's almost a book banning kind of thing, a book burning kind of thing. So this sort of, I hadn't thought about it that way. This sort of, like you said, the sort of schizophrenic view where I'm going to hold these ideals and then I'm going and these, and the hypocrisy, I think is a common theme among all of this. And I look, you and I probably hold hypocritical views in our lives, right? In our personal daily lives, we probably catch ourselves believing two things that are not, totally congruent with one another. At the same time, once, sometimes I just have to say, I can't explain that, right?
Right.
Why is it that an organization, can't embrace that also and say, look, we can't really explain why sometimes we feel icky, for lack of a better word, icky about, we have bones that maybe should be, that maybe we should not have at one time, accessed without permission and stuff. And that doesn't feel right. And it feels hypocritical that that we also gained knowledge from those bones. And we'd like to figure out how to feel better about that. And instead, I feel like this is very naive. We see this in our undergraduate students. They think that they learn something, or they're the generation that has all the answers, right? And so, they're never going to change their minds, and they're never going to grow and learn and have a different opinion. This is the way the world works. And to suggest, this goes along with what you were saying about what we were saying about gender and sex historically, the idea that the values or the ideas that we have now are the most correct will not need to be revised, whatever. And so therefore we should destroy, the past, or inhibit the research of the future, because we believe that we've got it now. We're perfect now. Anthropology is, it's like, oh, we're evolving. Well, what are you evolving into? Psychology is also evolving very much into, as you say, a sociological, sort of political commentary kind of thing, as opposed to actual, primary research. And it makes me sad for the future. And it makes me sad for you also. I know that you're right now, since you're in Heterodox, you're very protected from from some of you had a support system around you. I don't know what it's going to be like when you go back to San Jose State.
Well, fortunately, I'm not going back to San Jose. Oh. I'm retiring at the end of May 2024. That was a requirement of my settlement. I saw no reason to continue on there. The skeletal collections are being reburied. The x-rays will literally be burned. And if they say that I'm lying, I have lots of back and forth emails and texts that say that. I've been told that I cannot use any data that has been previously collected to do any research on skeletal remains of Native Americans, which is just an absurdity, since there's no way that they can control research from from people around the world who did collected data on these same bones. And I said, I'm done. And so I, drew up a settlement that I thought was fair to me. I honestly can say that I think that it was a win-win for both of me and the university. I don't think that they did bad out of the settlement, but I don't think I did bad either. It allowed me to come to Heterodox on full salary with retaining my retirement, and it will allow me to retire in 2024 with emeritus status. And there was no non-disclosure, and I think that it was the right thing to do. It's always hard to say, why didn't I go to court? Why not continue to do that battle? But my question to myself was, what would I have won? And I don't think I would have won anything, even if the judgment was in my favor, because the skeletal remains would have been gone. And so in a sense, it was not worth the fight anymore on that level. And I decided to take the fight up to a higher level, to continue to write about repatriation issues, and also the other issues in anthropology and academia in general, to try to save anthropology. I might not be successful, but I'm going to continue to try, because I love anthropology. I think it's a beautiful field. I think the study of skeletal remains is enlightening. I think that it's a shame that we seem to be going backward to this kind of concern of, oh, human remains are somehow similar to humans and therefore should be treated like humans, in the sense of we, getting a institutional review board approval,
Right.
and I think that what we should be looking at is, regardless of how these remains were obtained, putting them back in the ground is not going to do anything except bury data, bury science. And there's a very distinct difference, I think, with recently deceased individuals, where people are literally, making decisions about their loved ones. And I would hope that many people who are listening to this will think, well, maybe I should actually donate my body to science, because that's what I plan to do, and that's what my family plans to do. And I think it is the only way we're going to have skeletal collections. But there is a difference between saying, a mother who just lost their child and is going through that grieving process, and a skeletal remains from individuals who died even 50 years ago. I just think there is a difference between that. If there's no immediate family, I think that this is a material, a resource, rather than a human living being, or a human with attached memories to someone.
It's part of that sort of like, internal struggle that we all go through, right? Like, what's the line? And, if it's our relative versus, an unknown person's relative. And I think that's there's value in having that discussion, as opposed to just sort of a blanket, I don't know, value judgment. And I'm gonna go out on a limb here. This is my personal opinion. After almost 3 years now of after being canceled, and I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, you said how much you love anthropology, and I feel the same about my field. I just and it feels to me, this is very much my feeling, that it is often the people who love the field the most that seem to be the most comfortable talking about the uncomfortable thing. And it feels like the people who are just sort of going through the motions in the field, that seem to be more comfortable just latching on to, a value or an ideology. And maybe, I mean, I want to be careful to not to suggest that there's anything personality wise, or that it's some characteristic, because I don't think it is. I think it's human nature to go along with the crowd, right? And the latest, and it does take a particular constitution to be a dissident. At the same time, I think one of those constitutions may, in fact, be a different kind of attachment to the field, a deeper love, and I imagine from the way that you talk, this true attachment to those artifacts, and a love and respect and an honor. What an honor it was to handle those artifacts.
Yeah, and I would say, I think that that's a really interesting point, because I'd say, like, some people have said, oh, it was disrespectful for me to call the skeletal collection old friends. But that's what they were to me. And you can think of it as, some people, librarians sometimes would refer to their book collections as their old friends, right? So I don't think that that's disrespectful at all. And I can see where, like, certain times when I see certain images, I think, oh, that's not,
yeah,
I would never do that. That's tacky or disrespectful, or, such as, I personally wouldn't, like, take a skeleton and dress it up right? Like funny, put a funny outfit on it. I just think that that's a little tacky. So I'm not saying, so I think that what we have to view, how we have to view things if in is with that person's intent. So if I saw a researcher who had done something like put a hat on a skull, I maybe wouldn't do it, but I wouldn't automatically assume that that was meant as disrespectful or so forth. I would think, I wonder why he did that, or and then listen to their explanation, and if it made sense to me, I'd be like, oh, okay. So I do think that there's this kind of, there's only one way to understand things. There's only one way to treat something respectfully. That is just not true. And we can look throughout history and prehistory and see that burial patterns and disposal of bodies took for many different forms, and I guarantee you that those individuals were not thinking, oh, how can I disrespect these individuals, as opposed to this is our tradition. And yet I also think that there are times, I guarantee you, that if you took like a large population in the past, let's say large group of Native Americans who were pre-contact Native Americans, who were living in villages, semi-sedentary, and they were seeing when people died and how those people were being interred. Maybe some of them were like, you know what, I really don't want that for myself, because that's human nature too. It's just like to have different views. And I've told this story before, but my grandfather, who I never met, he was born, I believe, in 1896, and he had a lifelong fear of being buried alive. He always said he did not want to be buried. He had a lifelong fear of being buried alive, which was not uncommon in that era. He's German. Yeah. And when he died, his wife, my grandmother, and one of his sons, my mother's the youngest of 12, so one of her 7 brothers were insistent that my grandfather, Gustav, would receive a burial. And they buried him, which he never wanted, and they buried him in a white suit, which he would have hated. But this was this was their grieving process. Now, because it's Germany, a lot of graves get exhumed to make space for new ones. Although he was under historic preservation because of his artwork, and also because one of his sons was quite a well-known German philosopher. My uncle, who was supposed to make sure that the historic preservation was taken care of continuously, he let it slip, and my grandfather was exhumed. He was cremated, and so my thing is, in the end, he got what he wanted. He didn't know it because he was dead, but it's, some people may say, oh my goodness, that's terrible that he was exhumed, and he was buried and now he's exhumed and then cremated. But we have to have a viewpoint that individuals are individuals and have different perspectives throughout history and prehistory, and it is not upon us to try to figure out what each individual's perspective was. It is upon us as anthropologists, as physical anthropologists I'm talking now, to study those remains, to try to reconstruct the past in the fullest way and most accurate way possible. And that's how we respect them.
I see similar kinds of things in my field. So I was reading, so you wrote, in a field, schools run by anthropologists, at sort of progressive places like, where you were in University of Washington and that kind of thing. So, and I was reading, this was news to me, about excluding menstruating women to view some Native American bones and that kind of thing. And I was thinking to myself, well, how about no men touching any female bones because of the patriarchy? Or could we do like no Muslim should touch Jewish bones, or vice versa, or no black person touching the bones of a white person, no white person touch. I mean, how far can we go with this? Why not ban women from the field altogether if they can only do their work during certain times of a month, or or only allowed to be around certain bones during, why ban women? And this is a really provocative question. I don't expect you to answer this question, but what about a man who's transitions to a woman? Is that woman now, sociologically, a woman allowed to touch bones? And this is, it's just ridiculous to suggest that you could draw some kind of line like that.
It's absolutely absurd. And these kind of restrictions on field schools have been happening for quite a while. Berkeley's another place that had some of these. And basically the concept is that because it's the Native Americans who are requesting these restrictions, that we cannot judge that. I would say that, I literally have made the argument in classes and other settings and NAGPRA settings that because would we say the same thing if it was somebody who was prejudiced against somebody's skin color? And I would sure hope not. Yes. I would sure hope not. One of the things that they did at San Jose State is that when they locked me out of the curation facility to keep me away from the skeletal remains, and then they wrote up a new set of protocols for handling the remains. I had written the original, the set since 2004, I should say, not the original, but since I was there, I wrote protocols for that, and they rewrote them. And one of the protocols included a line that said menstruating personnel are not allowed in the curation facility and not allowed to handle skeletal remains. And I said, this is a Title IX violation, and if it's not removed, I will file a Title IX suit. It was removed because of that. And they even wrote down like no menstruating personnels were negatively affected. They didn't even want to say women, right? But like, in a sense, if you are menstruating, it is nobody's business whether you are or not. You are not required to tell anybody, and it's sexist to assume that. And it boils down to the concept of menstruation is dirty, and therefore you cannot be with us. And it's not only handling the bones in field school, it's also you can't eat with the rest of the group. The dishes have to be washed separately. This is outright sexism. It's a shameful thing for anybody to engage in this type of behavior. And if the tribes who are interested in upholding the sexism are not willing to let this sexism go by the wayside, my answer would be that we shouldn't be collaborating with them. Just like I wouldn't collaborate with somebody who held prejudices against people of different skin colors, different races, different religions. I think these are, prejudices, and yet it seems that anthropologists are perfectly fine with accepting these
and
prejudices.
Them on the wall, by the way.
Yeah, and basically, as long as it hasn't come from a Western culture, they're fine with it. Another example is one of the databases that is being created for artifacts and I'd have to look up the exact tribes that were involved, but they were concerned that the database should have information from both male and female artifacts in the same data set, because females should not be able to get the information about certain male sacred artifacts. This is databases. This is to me absurd. And I think that anthropologists need to step up and say, we will not collaborate with efforts that discriminate against people based on sex, race, religion, etc.
Yeah, and I think that, stepping up is really the problem. I do think that there are a lot of people who feel this way. I mean, I guess I should say that.
I hope so.
People,
it's so
we sure
hard.
aren't hearing from them.
We're not hearing from them. And it's so hard to know, because I know some people are just silent. But I do remember, quite early on in my career at San Jose State, a cultural anthropologist had told me, and she considered herself a feminist. So this was in 2004 or 5. So she told me, in regards to female students' dress, clothing, she said, if I had a daughter, I would rather see her in a full hijab than in a mini skirt, like some of our students wear. It looks so slutty. Something along those lines. And my response was, I would rather live in a world where my daughter, if I had one, could wear whatever she wanted. That is feminism. The other is not. It's just anti-Westernism.
I was just looking through some of the other. So, I know one of the things that the anthropology and the letter from that canceled your presentation. They hope to become more unified. Basically, they hope to have less diversity of thought. That's how I read it. Is that how you read it too?
Absolutely. And I think this sends a chilling message that anybody who disagrees with the current trend will not be invited onto the program. Right. I think it's telling that, you would think that any science should be unified. I think debate and diverse perspectives is key to understanding the world. And it could be that some of these descendant voices, even if everybody would say, this is, this vanilla ice cream is chocolate, that doesn't mean that this one person who says, no, it's vanilla, isn't correct. Right. And so I think that when you remove people for having different opinions, you lose the ability to possibly have the right answer. And although some questions will never have a single correct answer, some will, of course, some will, and you're losing that ability. I think there's a real difference between saying, you have to talk on subject, right? So when I'm teaching primate, monkeys, apes, and humans, I'm not going to talk about, modern forensic science. So you have to talk on subject, fine. I think it's even okay to say you have to have a certain academic achievement. These kinds of things are norms. They can be applied evenly, justly to everybody. But when you say you have to say the same things that we want you to say, this is no longer science. It's similar to a cult or a religion then.
And I have always prided myself, and again, I sort of saw that sprinkled in, what you wrote, on for example, my students not knowing my political affiliation, to going as over the top in being, looking at the alternative perspective when we designed our experimental research, that we must consider this, and a lot of times I live in a progressive state where my students are quite progressive, and they would, they didn't want to investigate that side of the hypothesis because they were, very, very liberal in their thinking, and they didn't want to think about the opposing view. and include that into their study because they felt it wasn't interesting. Now, I think that we are being discouraged openly from that, from writing that line, from looking at another perspective, or from trying to be opaque as opposed to transparent regarding our back. So there's only one we're allowed to have, one viewpoint we're allowed to have, and we must transmit that. They're asking us to make sure that we say those things. And we refused, as you have, we refused to apologize for good science. That's just, it's like, no, we don't apologize for good science. And that's basically what, I mean, sort of like your lawsuit. It's like it probably wouldn't have done any good. And there's plenty of examples where schools will just continue until you go bankrupt. And then they declare, it's like you win, but you're bankrupt. And so it doesn't really, you don't win anything. It's the same thing with apologies. They're useless. They are just one more way to attack. But, that's just another reason to attack people for asking questions. You're just asking questions. It's, so, well, you didn't apologize for your question, or you didn't apologize correctly for your question, or whatever. And it made me sad. Again, it makes me sad when I read some of this, this language, what they're willing to put in writing. I mean, I have it in writing from my university. You said you have university emails and stuff, that diversity of thought is, and other kinds of diversity, like, first generation college students, or maybe military veterans in my courses, or in my research lab, or, so it wasn't just ethnic diversity. I was talking about other kinds of diversity. Like, look, we have ethnic diversity, we have racial diversity in my lab, and we also have other kinds of diversity. And I have it in writing. That's not the kind of diversity that we're interested in. And, when you're willing to put the kind of thing that the Anthropological Association was willing to put in writing, when you're willing to put those kinds of things in writing, I don't know how else to feel but sad for our fields,
Yeah, I think that's right. It's a sadness. And, although, like, my students know my perspective on repatriation because it's kind of hard to hide.
Yeah. Well, now but yeah.
But I think the thing is that throughout my career, I've often assigned writings that are completely opposed to my own views.
Right.
So, like, when I talk about reburial and repatriation, I assign an article that's for it,
right,
as well, and I don't look for the worst example to make me look better. I look for the best example to give them something to think about. And of course, would I love it if all the students were like, oh yes, Professor Weiss, you are absolutely right. We should not rebury any bones. Of course, I'd love that. But I don't believe in indoctrination. And I've never given a student a bad grade for disagreeing with me on a topic that is of an opinion. If I give them a femur, they better label it as a femur and not a humerus, right? But I never felt that it was my place to tell them what side of this debate that they should fall on. And I've worked with researchers who disagree with me on the repatriation issue. I would never want to silence anyone who has a different perspective on me, whether it's about the binary sex and gender issue, whether it's about repatriation. That's not my mentality. That's not who I am.
And they need to be able to talk about both sides because they're in the field.
And they need to be able to think about why they've come to the conclusions that they have.
Right.
And then also maybe change their mind. Right. I think that although some things I have not changed my mind with, I have not changed my mind on reburial issues, but there are other issues that I have, changed my opinion on. People sometimes accuse me of having a particular opinion on how and when the Americas were peopled. A lot of people think that I think that the Americas were peopled very early on, very, very late, so very recent, as opposed to very ancient. And I can honestly say I'm up in the air on that issue. But they think because I'm for the preservation of remains, that I think that there's not really ancient, that the lineages don't go very far back. I can honestly say that connection is not a connection that I make. I'm just waiting. I'm just hoping that they find a 20,000-year-old skeleton to look at, right? But if they don't, I'm not convinced yet that the Americas were people 30,000 years ago or 25,000 years ago. But if there's a new evidence, so there's a lot of things that I'm actually quite on the fence about. And I think that that's okay.
I think it's a good thing, right?
Yeah,
We're open to more research, and it's the opposite. It's the narrow-mindedness of people who want that clear line on everything. And I do think that once you've been canceled, once you've been outed as wrong on something according to the powers that be currently, contemporary cultural narrative, I think then there is much more. It's like, oh well, how about this litmus test? How about this one? How about this one? How about this one? And things that maybe other people get a pass on, we don't, because they are trying so hard to categorize us and label us. And I think that when we defy those labels, they try harder. I really do.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things about the panel that was canceled by the American Anthropological Association that will be held as a webinar now on November 8th is that there's 5 speakers and a discussant, right? So Carol Hooven is the discussant, and then there's Kathleen Lowry, there's me, there's Michelle Soros, Kathleen Richardson, and Sylvia Carrasco. I hope I pronounced everybody's name close enough. And the thing is that they have very different perspectives on certain aspects of anthropology than I do. We are united in thinking that sex is an important concept, but we are not united in every aspect of our views on anthropology, which is why I think it would have been a great panel to have in person. I've joked that even if nobody came to the panel, we probably would have been arguing with each other, So, but I do think that, there's this kind of like, oh, well, you agree on this, therefore you must all be lockstep and everything else. And that's just not true.
Right. And again, it's demonstration of a narrow-mindedness on others' parts, not our own. So I was thinking, even again, this is like I'm going too far here, but if gender and sex, if these things, maybe anthropology textbooks shouldn't mention sex. Maybe doctors should, I was thinking like, oh, doctors should just treat everyone the same, right? So they shouldn't ask people about their gender. It's like, oh, if you're throwing up in the morning, I'll just give you anti-nausea medicine. We won't consider, your sex. And again, I know that I'm going, it's like, oh, you're going too far. And yet it feels to us like people are going too far. And I think the way that they've set the rules, it's not the bridge too far is we're on it.
We're on it. I think that's a very good way of putting it. The bridge too far is we're on it. We're almost over it.
Yes.
We've almost crossed it. And you talk about changes in textbooks. They are making those changes. You talked about doctors in medicine. They are making those kinds of changes in medical training. And this is going to have horrific consequences for everybody.
Mhm.
It's not just going to have bad consequences for women, it will have bad consequences for men as well. And for those who transitioned and detransitioners, of course, there's just no escape that erasing the importance of biological sex will not be negative on understanding human health, human biology. I've been reading a lot for my talk, and I've been looking at some of the research on bone health, and we see now that individuals who are put on puberty blockers never reach peak bone mass, even if they decide to detransition or go through their transition. They don't reach peak bone mass, which means that years down the road, decades down the road, they will be having triple, for men, it's like triple the risk of fractures, of osteoporotic fractures. This is putting people at risk of
this is no joke, because
and this is no joke.
Once you start breaking bones, my mother's currently in a wheelchair because of osteoporosis. And, you start to see the cognitive effects when somebody, thank God that we're not seeing that at this point. But once you go down, so it's not like, so they take vitamin D and calcium. That's not how it works.
It doesn't work that way.
And this is a health problem with an aging population that, is very, very serious.
So you're going to have a huge wave of osteoporotic individuals that the medical community is not prepared for. There won't be enough, care for these individuals. And, that can a 12-year-old assess what that means? That when they are 65,
nothing bad was going to happen to us when we were 12.
Right. I just think that that's why sometimes we don't let children make certain decisions, and I just think that this is going to have a lot of negative consequences. One of the other issues is that I'll be talking about in my talk is about feminization surgery. And one of the things we know now so far is that when you look at the skeleton and you can make a determination between male and female, even when somebody has undergone feminization surgery, so a male who wants to become a woman, the forensic databases and so forth will still line that person up as a male. So all the efforts, it's not going to erase binary sex. And I'm not saying that these people shouldn't be able to make these decisions when they're adults, but I'm just saying feminization surgery, medical transitioning does not change biological sex. It changes their gender, but not their sex. And we need to be aware that by erasing the binary sex and researching binary sex, I think we're doing people a huge disfavor, and it would affect the most vulnerable people, those individuals who are murdered, for example, who we don't know their identification. If you can't say, let's start at sex and age, you're not going to go anywhere. And people might say, oh, well, why don't you just do DNA? DNA is only going to be useful if you have that person already in a record to identify. You first have to narrow it down to, sex, age, how they died, things like that. And then once you've narrowed it down and look at databases of, who's missing and so forth, then you can do DNA. But DNA is remarkable, but DNA alone is not the solution.
Well, people are addicted to it because they grew up. People grew up on what?
Like Bones and CSI,
yes,
right?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, my students went, and I'm sure you saw it too. You mentioned forensic anthropology before, and it's, that was a big, uh, a big deal there for a while. I mean, students go through phases of what
Right,
they're most
right.
interested in, but that was big for a while. So I want to make sure that we've, that you don't have anything else on your list that you wanted to talk about. I also want you to plug one more time. We will link in the podcast to your books and to the website and a few other things that you sent me that you wrote, so that people can read your Quillette article and was it Spike? So a couple of other
Yes.
things. We'll put those in the podcast notes. But I want to give you an opportunity to say anything that you feel like you didn't get to mention, and encourage people. Doesn't have to be academics, right, to come to your Heterodox
Right.
talk?
That's true. I mean, to be a member of Heterodox Academy, you must be an academic.
Right.
But to watch the webinar, you do not have to be an academic, and you can either register for it. There's a registration link on the Heterodox Academy website, but also, as mentioned, it will be posted, and it's on November 8th, I believe, from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern. It will start with a brief introduction by John Tomasi, who is Heterodox president currently. Then there will be the 5 talks, I believe. Each one's 15 minutes, and ending with a discussant, Carol Hooven, who's the author of Testosterone, and then time for questions, time for questions and answers. Only those people who register can ask questions. So if you want to ask questions, make sure to register. And the registration will be limited to a certain number because of that. But it will be live streamed on YouTube as well, and the link will be there. So if you're one of these people who's like, I'm not going to ask a question, that's okay. You can still watch it live stream.
And will non-academics or somebody like me who's in psychology, will we be able to understand what you're talking about?
I think so. One of the things that I pride myself with is making my talks, whether they are for an academic audience or not, accessible to a wide audience. I think that anthropology is such an exciting field. There's so much to learn that I want as many people as possible to understand it and enjoy it. And so I can't speak for everybody in the panel, but mine will be understandable by a wide audience. I've even gone through and made sure that I don't use I don't say things like mandible without also mentioning that that's the jawbone, right?
This is so relevant to all of us right now in another way, which is that a lot of artifacts are appearing because of droughts in certain places. Like there's other reasons why this is really interesting to people who are just seeing this kind of thing in the news, where new bones, new artifacts are being revealed, right?
Yeah, and one of the fascinating things about anthropology is that every year there's something new. I hope that we can continue to study these with as an objective eye as possible, but whether it's because of droughts or torrential rains that uncover things, or planned excavations or construction. Several years ago, when they were redoing the Athens underground, they, whole cities were discovered.
Wow.
So there's always something new. I get quite a lot of emails from people sending me like, have you seen this? And sometimes I'm like, yeah, I saw that. And sometimes I'm like, no, that's fascinating. The other thing is re-examinations of old remains, of remains that have been preserved, which is one of the important reasons to preserve skeletal collections, is because we can re-examine them with newer, better tools to fine-tune our understanding. I saw just the other day an article that mentioned the re-examination of a donated forensic collection called the Hammond Todd Collection from Cleveland that looked at frailty and mortality in 1918. So during this the 1918 influenza, right? To compare it how, the COVID-19 deaths, and to help us understand pandemics more closely, or more fully, I should say. So new discoveries all the time and reanalyses of discoveries. And this is why retaining collections is so important.
Well, I am looking forward to your talk. I hope that other people who see this will sign up and tune in or watch the live stream. Again, we'll post everything, and I guess we should end on that positive note, right?
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a great conversation. So happy to meet you.
Yeah, thank you for being here with us.